Welcome to the Green Ring, and thanks for watching. This video is 8th in a series of 9 presenting a note-by-note analysis of Wagner's Das Rheingold Scene 4. Built on nearly 2 centuries of scholarly literature, this massive journey aspires to examine in its entirety Der Ring des Nibelungen to its final note. I hope you'll take this voyage with me when I'm still working to complete. For an explanation of who I am and more on the reasons for this series, please check out my preface video. Its link is supplied below, along with those for the other videos preceding this one. We pick up where we left off in Dover's full score on the first stave of page 279 as Donner proceeds to banish the ugliness of Fasold's murder. The Thunderer's Scena clears the air for both gods and audiences, though begun over the dour pedal of the Curse Coda's final chord, whose minor seventh diminished harmonies linger ominously in the tuba choir, that soft timpani roll from the curse sustained through Donner's first vocal. On static notes separated by a minor third descent and capped by a falling tritone, meaning a ring fragment distortion, the Thunderer cites a schwilles Gedünst, surrounding the gods. Stage directions call for the background to be obscured by Nebel, root of the words Nibelung and Nibelheim, an effect usually handled only desultorily, if at all. After a crotchet rest, he slides through a reverse ash interval, down a reverse melody note strophe, another hint of the coming racial war, then hops up a third to plunge a sixth, an inversion of Curse Lust, possibly calculated to alleviate Wotan's sorrows. During this cell, tubas softly move ominously through air to chord notes into pure tonic B-flat minor, even as Donner's voice suggests the major mode with a rapid triplet static ash interval bouncing on air to fourths into a giant turn reversal, as in Loge's final Rhine Maiden plea. During this phrase, the Thunderer proposes to dispel the bleiche Gewölk with blitzenden Wetter, an idea whose cap of a plunging fifth casts doubt on his ultimate success. Tubas intone another diminished seventh pedal minim as this syntactic ambivalence resolves with his next utterance, an upward air to fourth and low ash interval on a third to create heroic melody notes, capped in a Flosshilde iteration, with its sense of heroic defiance, the whole leading into sunny major mode. In short, Donner's introductory vocal succinctly outlines the problems Wotan faces, what threatens to defeat his project, and how the Father God may still achieve his triumph. As a last note, the syntactic role in the drama played by those seemingly irrelevant yet insidious bouncing thirds is also soon revealed, which, though clear markers of vitality, have yet to solidify into any distinctive repeating module. Donner purges the grim flavor of the last few minutes with what at first glance seems the very brand of Meyerbeerian froth the Meister so often excoriated. Yet far from being mere pyrotechnics, the episode serves a bundle of narrative and syntactic ends. To begin with, Donner's storm apostrophe turns entirely on primeval nature morphemes, which evoke the Rheingold prelude. These shift back and forth between major and minor, Erda's hallmark, to underline that, like Fricka, Freya, Froh, and Loge, Donner embodies natural forces arising directly from the Earth Mother's primal fount. Viola's cellos lift on fingered, sextuplet, semiquaver tremolos, cellos gone silent after a measure, and crotchet, at which point violins join violas. In 2 measures' time, these string choirs divide into 18 dizzying lines to repeat insidious crisscrossing tonic arpeggios. Shaped in continuous sine waves, these induce a mood very like the Rheingold prelude, though charged here with the raging energy of the skies, as, together with Donner's vocal, the ensemble progressively whips the clouds into a storm frenzy. These already familiar sonic ideas mingle with new syntax, linking Rheingold to Valkyr. The Thunderer's first vocal is an unforgettable morpheme which stamps its indelible impression on the work, yet after its extended development here, it sounds only 2 more times. Both markedly different from this first instance, both prior to Valkyr Act 3. Volkswagen calls this Donner's storm charm, Kobe the Donner motif, Newman Donner as the god of thunder, Hutchison simply motive of Donner, Holman Donner's call, and Sabor thunder. Cook calls it merely Donner, and points out its succession of long, short, long rhythms, along with its leaps of a third, fourth, fifth, and sixth, make it an immediate development of the Erda nature melody. The Thunderer introduces its central module vocally, the one audiences remember, since it repeats on massed horns regularly following each of Donner's vocals to separate them. The morpheme consists of an up-down leap on pure Erda fourths, followed by a rising-falling major sixth, ended with another fourth leap. It's as if the syntax purges the minor sixth tritone clouds from Wotan's immediately previous regrets over the evil cost of Valhalla, and it's this module alone which massed horns twice echo once Donner falls silent for 16 measures, allowing the orchestra alone to produce the sequence's impressive climax. Joined to the idea of a storm, this morpheme opens the epic's next chapter, but of that more in its time. However, what gives this Rheingold passage more syntactic weight than does the Donner module alone is the interstitial material in Donner's vocal, which often takes the form of a static ash interval, but whose real meat is something else again. Leaps of a third are common in Donner's vocal, as are those of a fifth, nor can it be coincidental that together these produce Curse Lust, a module which is reverberated in vocals through various guises before Albrecht's malediction and continually after it. As importantly, 2 long-short-long syncopated modules revolve around bounces on thirds. The second and last of these in the Thunderer's arietta joins with an abandonment triad. This cell, reminiscent of the Rhine Maiden's frolics, becomes a central pillar of Valkyrie syntax, which, unlike the Donner module, do saturate the coming epic and always to evoke the god's heroic domination of the sky. The abandonment triad in his vocal is a mystery here in Rheingold, which must clarify itself in Valkyr, along with the reverse ash interval on a plunging octave, which illuminates his second reference to himself as Donner der Herr, the whole phrase including another Curse Lust distortion. There is a conceptual link between Donner and Wotan's as yet unborn warrior daughters, spawned to negate the curse, and their bond is thanks to this, the Thunderer's one standout scene, its entire focus on the air, specifically as involved with storms. The Donner morpheme, first repeated in the Valkyr Act 1 prelude, also characterizes stormy air, and, while it forever disappears before Act 3 when the warrior maidens first appear en masse, multiple crisscrossing orchestral sine waves dominate that later sequence as well, and its stage directions call for Einsam Wolkenzuge jagen, wie von Sturm getrieben, an Felsensäume vorbei, a description which implies this episode's visual setting. Both Thunderer and Valkyries are templates for the godly heroic, so Donner's apostrophe stirs in Wotan, passively observing and plotting as he's done throughout, the concrete plan he soon voices and which dominates his actions for the remainder of the drama. Once Donner falls silent, disappearing in the clouds per stage instructions, the orchestra lingers in B-flat minor to leap back into major, as tubas roar the penultimate Donner strophe. The harmony shifts to a tensely expectant diminished seventh, while trumpets, trombones echo a last pulse of the Donner syntax, which maintains its apparent tonic leaps, though shifting them to minor sixth and a concluding minor third. A loge-based rising chromatic scale, shared alternatively by full brass woodwind choirs, rises inexorably, though more slowly, on bowed triplet string quavers, to the moment Donner strikes his hammer against a rock. The blow and the lightning bolt it's meant to produce are simulated by a lone anvil impact followed by, lacking the brass, the full orchestra shooting up a major septuplet arpeggio into a potent sting, joined by the brass, a touch reminiscent of those times Wotan has forcibly interposed his will. Thus motivated, a timpani roll simulates thunder while low strings in sextuplets mutter a measure of Loge's tremolos, replaced in the next two with rising-falling chromatic signs. One can only think the Meister eschewed the delight of showing Donner as he effects this wonder, because the stage mechanics of his day couldn't pull it off to his liking. If the written instructions are followed, his voice alone emerges from the sonic darkness as, reinforced by a timpani roll, octavo low strings wander across two more signs, then down to their lowest registers as he urges his brother Froh to produce the famed Rainbow Bridge. Vocal leaping thirds capped by Albrecht's threats, a seemingly ironic touch to bear surprising fruit within moments. In the next measure, low strings trade Loge's tremolo, then, in the last measure's final three beats, grow still on them. Wagner judged this episode impossible to represent effectively with detailed stage action, and those productions available on video prove him right. Donner's vocal is invariably treated as a speech delivered face-front by a largely immobile singer, while the interwoven strophes of his morphemes sound without visual comment. Lacking minute variations, stagings as diverse as Bayreuth, Munich, Copenhagen, Valencia, Lisieux, and even China offer little more than a man swinging a hammer prop, which ranges from laughably small to grotesquely huge, to even a golf club, the hammer strike producing either a tepid flash of stage light or nothing at all, the storm affected by no more than dry ice, smoke machine clouds, or listless projections, the rainbow either absent, negligible, or weirdly symbolic, Lisieux even representing it as a snowfall. Given the morpheme's subsequent limited presence, this habit of producers downplaying the passage might seem less a narrative flaw than a disappointment, yet slighting its vital connection to the Valkyries and all they represent still constitutes a weakening of the visual sonic process of association which makes the epic work. Hard on Donner's heels and switching to triple time, the Rainbow Bridge melody establishes something like that sense of peace for which the gods have longed throughout Rheingold. Not a morpheme proper, since it never repeats after this scene, the rainbow module is nonetheless another natural rising-falling sign, which marches 3 times without vocals on cello's low woodwinds beneath high woodwind chords and triple quaver pulses. Meanwhile, glittering sextuplet semiquavers weave their crisscrossing signs through the famed 6 harps, violin-viola choirs divided in 4 groups of 2 soloists pulsing on semiquaver-fingered septuplet tremolos. Darcy opines this sequence points directly back to the prelude, and might even have partly inspired it. Majestically noble as it is, the rainbow morpheme itself is the tetralogy's single most empty. Its 2 notable features an initial rise on a treaty-like arpeggio, while ironically and repeatedly incorporating strophes of Albrecht's Defiance as part of its integument. These implications of the gods' compromised paradise aren't lost on analysts, though none associate them with the morpheme itself. Even so, the Meister's keen eye for ambivalent sonic irony is hard at work here. Froh's vocal, like Donner's before him, contains the passage's major syntactic interest, and begins as the 3rd orchestral rainbow strophe merges into the 4th. While following that morpheme, Froh deviates from it strategically at intervals, first topping his initial rising arpeggio with a plunging octave on the word Brücke, and at the very point when the rising instrumental arpeggio lands on one of its several abandonment triads, subtly hinting at the ultimate evil to which this pathway leads. After resuming on a dragon-like turn with its air to chord notes, he continues on a defiance strophe, as the orchestral melody ossifies into 4 consecutive pulses of that supposedly dire module which, it should be recalled, includes melody notes, emphasizing how prominent they are in the rainbow as a whole. The Vala's presence is of course strongly co-opted by this weird distortion of her natural world. Rising in air to 4th, Froh concludes by inverting the heroic air to notes, followed by a last defiance iteration, then an echo of the embryonic Valkyrie syntax from Donner's vocal, complete with its abandonment triad. This triggers a reprise of Valhalla syntax very like Scene 2's first encomium to the Citadel, not surprisingly, as woodwind's pulses fall silent, leaving the harp signs along with fingered tremolos in divisi violin viola choirs to maintain the caressing glow, while the brass choir begins with Valhalla Part 1, twice repeated, an exact duplicate of that beginning Scene 2. Part 1, of course, is the ring-derived falling-rising sign, whose opposition to the previous host of rising-falling signs subtly emphasizes the corrupt nature-opposed power of the immortal's false idol. As in Scene 2, Part 1's second half repeats 6 times, which fragment outnumbers repetitions of the complete morpheme by more than 2 to 1, yet further stress on nature's power chained within the ostensibly glorious citadel. Here it also acquires an ingenious new significance thanks to its Scene 3 conjunction with Loge's chord note flicker, there connoting arrogant power bids. That evolution is particularly apt as Wotan proudly surveys the afternoon glory of his now fully capitalized fortress, an impression heightened by regular trombone trumpet pulses of the complete Valhalla Ash interval. 2 more iterations of Part 1 follow, the second quieter than the first, its ring fragment cell lapsing into minor mode, while its modulating second half attempts to recover the syntax's wonted major, but instead prolongs its yearning minor, as the god at last begins his vocal salute to the fortress tinged by his lingering fears. He launches this atop 2 measures empty of Valhalla morphemes, tubas lapsing into a pedal while bass trumpet alone presents a remarkable syntactic bundle by rising a third and falling on chord notes into a reverse ash interval on a third, which segues, of all things, into the giant turn. Lest this seem an irrelevant happenstance, it should be remembered a behind-the-scenes war now ensues between the giants for possession of the ring, with its implications of racial commingling, or does so at least in Wagner's imagination. And it's this race which has built Valhalla, thus knows all the secrets of its inner workings. Wotan's vocal intones a static ash interval at a slight parallax, followed by its reversed form, descending on chord notes to bounce on thirds and sink on another chord note pulse. His words invoke the evening's beauty gleaming off his castle, while his syntax neatly paraphrases that fortress's energetic yet compromised foundation on the sand of nature's disapproval. Trombones woodwinds resume another 4 strophes of Valhalla Part 1's extension, ash intervals leaven between 3 trumpets, the whole modulating back to major mode as his vocal expands his admiration by rising a third, moving through static notes to lift another third, the whole a broad abandonment triad outline. After 3 more static notes, he sinks a 4th into reverse chord notes, as if directing his mind back to that unformed racial solution to his woes. He falls into contemplative silence for a crotchet short of a breve rest, while brass repeat another pair of Part 1 extensions, the second making an upward harmonic shift not heard again until the end of Götterdämmerung, a premonition suggesting Wotan's following text, as he hints at the fortress's vulnerability only that morning. Over part 1's melody note cell, recovering from this distinctive harmonic novelty into its more wonted formulas, his voice resumes on static notes and a high ash interval, but on a minor third, followed by reverse melody notes and the dip of an air de fourth, his racial thoughts ever present. With its sense of his cloudy hopes for rescue by such means, his phrase's fourth descent moves into the Valhalla morpheme bundle's double strophes of its rare part 2, then the last half of part 3 with its repeating air chords. Atop this series, Wotan sings of his stronghold being herrenlos that morning on another static ash interval, and the third bounce from Donner's vocal, which, after a static ash interval, the immortal echoes by inverting the Thunderer's phrase into rising-falling air de fourths. The god finally achieves something like full contentment to a complete iteration of Part 4, Cook's Valhalla Cadence, a seal of benediction, its seemingly wanted yet newly rethought version meshing syntactic lines as perfectly as in a finely crafted jewel. Vocally, the god drops an air de fourth to rise on a sixth, which combined intervals, it should be noted, outline a more hopeful distortion of Curse Lust, that module which throughout Rheingold has telegraphed desire for the ring. He then traces the cadence's Freya cell, itself concluded by a rising fourth, thus bookending the developing love module with air de fourths. Second trumpet's pure world ash interval elicits in Wotan's vocal a rising sixth, a moment similar, if not identical, to a scene 2 hint at his extramarital sexual exploits, a seemingly minor detail which will have vast implication for the tetralogy's denouement. Amid all this, tubas provide the morpheme bundle's wanted spear-like bass, while first trumpet doubles the god's Freya cell, as the second caps its pure ash interval by descending a fifth. Bassoon's contrabasses sink in another spear scale, its last quaver topped in cellos with a second pure ash interval to join two horns in the beginning of a ring iteration. It's worth noting Wotan sings the words Verlockend vor mir, meaning his reaction to the castle, on the prominent Freya syntax. What the god loves about Valhalla isn't its protection for the goddess's power of love, but his own love of the power his fortress now assures him, and as Freya has been throughout Rheingold, his atavistic love is now under real threat. His fears haunt this optimistic reverie, troubled by the unhappy way in which the god has financed his hegemony, an unease portrayed on horns cellos by two consecutive ring iterations, followed immediately by two more, clarinets replacing horns. Bassoon's bass clarinet contrabasses provide an inky pedal for the initial pair, bass clarinet falling out for the last two, darkening the texture. Viola's violins trembling darkly in bowed semiquaver sextuplets. Unable to quite name what disturbs him, Wotan can only generalize about his Nicht-Wonig method achieving this stage in his bid for world rule. By contrast, his vocal bristles clarifying syntactic wealth. Following the ring fragment's diminished seventh harmony, he outlines a pair of Curse Lust strophes, the first dipping a minor third to rise a perfect fifth, then fall back on that same third, a hugely ambivalent fracture of the rising and falling triads. His second pulse descends on the minor third to lift a tritone, a sinister variant which initiates a more hopeful full ash interval on a minor third, which also includes heroic melody notes, only to descend a pathetic sixth, then rise through reverse chord notes into another minor third lift, then plunge a last still more hopeless sixth. In answer to this remarkable bundle, the Vala's morpheme whispers a single time on woodwind's horns in that same Neapolitan harmony predicting the immortal's doom. Over its final heroic notes, the horn woodwind pedal fades as string tremolos take stage with the fragment's tight diminished seventh harmonies, as the god intones Es naht die Nacht, recalling Albrecht's hordes of night to a reverse ash interval on another plunging sixth. Wotan pushes back vocally against this threat by rising a low ash interval on a third. That does the trick, at last triggering Wotan's great inspiration, during which he introduces one of the epic's most justly famed, yet paradoxically contested sonic landmarks, cheek to jowl with the repetition of several others. It's one of the tale's seminal moments, as dense as anything in Götterdämmerung, pointing the way to Wotan's pivotal Valkyrie Act II monologue, while linking the immortal's solution for his woes to a complex syntactic bundle as rich as it is striking. It's also a clear parallel to the cutting of the spear in Götterdämmerung, crystallizing in a few short bars a host of far-reaching ideas, while clarifying much in the work's syntax which has remained obscure until this moment. Due to its presentation of one syntactic module close on the heels of the next, often mixing them together, the passage is quoted at length and in detail, its explanation correspondingly meticulous. This, the tetralogy's most complex syntactic web to this point, achieves its purposes with remarkable economy. Its orchestration is no more than string tremolos and brass pedals with a single climactic timpani roll, all in support of Wotan's vocal interwoven by a few trumpet lines. Its syntax is almost bewilderingly involved, yet, despite introducing 3 quite new morphemes, its every module derives from previously familiar material. Against the ring fragment's tense diminished 7th harmonies continuing in string tremolos, the god praises the fortress against the coming night. Vor ihrem Neid bietet sie Bergung nun. His vocal a low ash interval on a third, followed by a consecutive pair of reverse melody notes, separated by that plangent rising 6th, destined to bring him his ultimate redemption. This organization makes the phrase's initial module yet another pulse of Flosshilda's heroic cry, whose echoes have pervaded Rheingold, including the god's own claim for his right to procreate at will, the giant seizing Freya, and Albrecht's tyranny over his fellow Nibelungs. To follow the last reverse melody, tremolo strings modulate bravely into a major G7 chord, initiating a swift crescendo that prepares C major, what both Darcy and Macrelis posit as signifying Wotan's highest hopes. These introductory measures further crystallized what's brewed in the god's mind since his Nibelheim trip, as suggested by the paired reverse melody notes, hints of which have accumulated since their first appearance as Renunciation of Love's Backbone, a role continued by Resignation, anticipated briefly in Wotan's Mortal World dalliances. They rustle through Loge's panegyric, whose implications develop in the Nibelheim visit to imply a hardened, even heroic resolve amounting to a racial change across the entire dwarfish tribe. This intensifies in Scene 4 as the dwarfs escape Albrecht's tyranny, then drive their tyrant's pleas to keep his ring until the syntax permeates his curse. As set to the words Bitte sie Bergung nun, the reverse melody notes sound twice in succession, connecting this descending 3-note phrase to the bulwark Wotan gradually envisions against the terrors he's encountered in both Albrecht and his slaves, dangers represented by the reverse melody notes. It's a natural lead-in to the god's mighty inspiration for defeating those threats, his overall plan represented first, if not solely, by the sword, probably the most recognizable morpheme in the ring, one of a handful whose moniker is universally accepted. Cook explains this pivotal syntax contains only tonic notes, directly allying it to the primordial forces epitomized in the Erda melody, the tetralogy's first continuously repeating morpheme. Closer examination suggests there's more to tell, for every note of this brief syntactically dense melody has a part to play. Here, as it first sounds, it begins on a rising Erda fourth, only to be followed by the doom-laden falling octave, a direct reference to that interval's prominence in the curse, which Wotan quickly underlines in his vocal as he launches the phrase Cook dubs the purpose of the sword, of which more in a moment. The sword, meanwhile, continues by rising on the abandonment triad, thus sowing the seeds of its own destruction, along with that of others involved with it. Yet it finishes on the last notes of Erda's morpheme, that portion which Cook demonstrates is the source of so much of the tetralogy's heroic syntax. Vocally, the immortal follows this unforgettable idea by saluting the castle as an unassailable haven, Cook's purpose of the sword, a proclamation divided in two phrases. The first begins with that octave plunge in defiant echo of the curse, and ends on an equally valiant rising fifth, the two intervals bracketing a bounce of a third to produce a distinctive figure whose rustlings shiver through the Rhine Maiden's predictions of the magic needed to forge the ring, a fragment that continues to lay down roots in Albrecht's threats against his Nibelung slaves, his fall at Loge's hands, the dwarf's pleas, his curse vocals, and finally both Donner's and Froh's vocals as they prepare Valhalla's effective first appearance. Perhaps as interesting, it concludes by mimicking the curse's finish. The immortal's scheme, after all, is predicated on his lust to regain the ring. Though not a morpheme proper, this modular bundle contributes recognition points during Valkyr, while further clarifying the syntactic associations of leaping thirds. As octavo low strings initiate a spear iteration, Wotan intones the overall bundle's second half, underlined by string tremolos, a phrase whose real weight begins with a morpheme that's played a decisive, though heretofore slightly amorphous role in the Rheingold syntax. Cook dubs this module the barrier, explaining it recurs in virtually all Wagner's operas to connote some barrier to aspirations of the drama's protagonists. He demonstrates it achieves this in the Ring by reversing heroic syntax such as the Walsungs and Annunciation derived from the Erda melody's last notes, whose initial rising melody notes form the backbone of the barrier. Cook suggests the operative sonic quality of these other noble morphemes is their rising fourth, whose dominant tonic progression, the barrier's first notes sounding as a plunging fifth, reverse to tonic subdominant. But this is by no means its first occurrence in the musical syntax, a vague, embryonic version of which initially sounds in Scene 1 during Albrecht's futile advances towards Velgunda, while early in Scene 2 Fricka takes it up as she berates Wotan's callous treatment of Freya, singing it 3 times in quick succession. Albrecht declares it still more forcefully in Scene 3, until it's an integral part of his fearsome control over his race thanks to the ring. Most recently, the god turns it against the dwarf in its pre-definitive form, complete with harmonization identical to that of his present inspiration. This morpheme also bears an eerie resemblance to the Nibelung tattoo, which, soon after it emerges definitively in the Scene 2-3 interlude, Albrecht develops vocally into something like the barrier's decisive form as he threatens his dwarves, albeit there its falling interval is a tritone, its rising notes 4 rather than the definitive 3. This last detail resolves when he drives his minions into view of the eavesdropping gods, the falling thirds which end both pulses disappearing from its definitive form. The passage also cements the morpheme's relationship to both the Rhine Maiden syntax and the tattoo inspired by it. When the tyrant dwarf reveals the ring for the first time, he launches that memorable sequence by twice intoning this barrier morpheme in virtually its definitive form, albeit its falling interval still a tritone. It echoes within moments as its nymph dwarf precursor module, rooting those syntactic overtones somewhere deep within the hearer's mind. The morpheme's associative roots are clear enough, given Fricka's opposition both to Wotan's aims for his fortress and his philandering, Albrecht battling the god's powers in general, which are energized by pursuit of the ring, the dwarf's twisted sort of heroism being the god's antithesis, and vice versa. It's in this last sense that another syntactic mystery grows clearer thanks to recognition of the barrier. In Scene 3, as the dwarf bullies his minions, he juxtaposes the barrier with its reversal, a module which itself already has a long history of embryonic development, meaning that one first heard on Flosshilda's lips as she bravely cries out to protect the Rheingold. After that, some variant of the module sounds frequently in vocals and invariably to signify resistance against some challenge or other. The first of these associations swirling around the dwarf himself, and has only just sounded in this, Wotan's magisterial inspiration. Though it won't declare its most definitive form until Siegfried, it's worth noting the module's general shape is a retrograde of the barrier, so that both aurally and conceptually it seems apt to dub it the anti-barrier. This also clarifies that phrase first heard on the Rhine Maiden's lips in Scene 1 as they propose dashing Alberich's romantic hopes, which I have dubbed chagrin. Its figurative association with expectations confounded literally turns the bold, heroic anti-barrier upside down. Meanwhile, the barrier's pure form, here during Wotan's inspiration at the end of Rheingold, is a descending fifth, followed by the rising melody note module, which oppose Wotan's plan to the epic's final pages. The phrase concludes on reverse melody notes with their roots in renunciation of love to form part of the apple's vitality. There are connotations of Nibelung's servility juxtaposed with the dwarf's tenacity running through the texture since the Scene 2-3 interlude, and continuing throughout the scene, into the Scene 3-4 interlude, until they make their way into landmark Scene 4 moments. As Wotan hurls down this gauntlet before the forces opposing him, the reverse melody notes also complete a rising-falling sign, a cell Donner has only just sung to the words "Zu blitzendem Wetter," that very tonic with which the Thunderer proposes to dispel the mists oppressing the gods. It isn't the first time the module's heard, of course. Only moments before Erde rises from the earth to separate Wotan from the ring, Loge makes his plea for the Rhine Maidens by singing it, as he couples the uniquely racial giant turn with its following inversion, a juxtaposition looking back to the fire sprite's advice for stealing the ring, and, even before that, Loge's ideal outcome in his panegyric. Most primally, this syntax has its roots in the Scene 1 prelude, both its rising and falling versions. The question is why this syntax is so pronounced in Wotan's stroke of inspiration, a mystery at least partially deciphered with a look at the narrative context of its previous iterations. Donner's is a practical if simplistic cure for Wotan's worries, the danger brushed aside with empty heroic bravado. However, Loge's more involved plea strikes Wotan at his ethical pivot point, and the god's response leaves no doubt which way he leans. Dein Versprechen bindet mich nicht, als Beute bleibt mir der Reif. When Fafner presses him, Wotan paraphrases Alberich's words of only minutes before. Alle Welt doch nicht fern lass ich den Ring. Though he finally yields the talisman on Erda's advice, this comment suggests the immortal already plots to have it back from the giant race by any means, the same resolve which motivates all of Cook's purpose of the sword, its inversion of the giant turn along with its other syntactically eloquent modules. Every one of these ideas point to the god's stratagem for seizing the ring, a ploy meant to defeat Loge's objections on behalf of the Rhine Maidens while exploiting the glittering bravado Donner exhibits in banishing the mists oppressing Valhalla. Wotan sings this to the words "Sicher vor Bang und Grauen," as he shifts dramatically from the initial sword pulse's brilliant major mode into a dark minor. This mysterious turn, a deep-laid thread of the drama's syntax, doesn't fully reveal its load of meaning until Siegfried, though it does play a key part in the first and last acts of Valkyr. For now, all an audience need know is that Wotan's plan directly opposes not only Alberich, but the giants as well, a narrative point any listener can easily assimilate from the dramatic action without any recourse to the rich syntax attending it. The last syntactic bundle revolves around its second iteration of the sword, concluding the passage with a unique variant of Valhalla Part 4, otherwise known as the Valhalla cadence. Here the sword lacks the upward air to fourth, which almost invariably launches it, throwing the emphasis on the sword's downward octave. As the drama progresses, that baleful interval plays a huge part in defining Wotan's plans, hand in hand with the sword itself and the mysterious reverse giant turn. As Cook observes, this Valhalla cadence does put a seal of majesty on the passage, yet the second sword's variant of its immediate precursor adds a key idea by moving from the minor mode back to major, ere the shadow passing over Wotan's triumph. As a whole, this Valhalla cadence's unique contribution to the work's evolving syntax is also found in the other alterations it makes to the individual modules comprising it. Though simple, their departures are eloquent. The wanted spear-derived bass line is missing, pushed back to separate the two halves of the god's bold declaration. Valkyr reveals Wotan's inspiration seeks to bypass his lawful bargain with the giants by relying upon someone not bound by his spear's laws. As such, replacing the Valhalla cadence's wonted pure ash interval on a rising octave, first, third trumpets intone a blazing low ash interval, a syntactic variant first heard as Velgunde Tons Albrecht, which modification later adheres to all manner of questionable misuses and or distortions of natural power. In the present case, the rising interval is a fifth, its most notable previous incarnation in that form just before Albrecht curses love and wrenches the gold from its natural resting place, thus associating it with the dwarf's crime. Cook explains Wagner's taste for associating upward leaps of a fifth with his heroes, making plain the interior logic of this touch, so that it's audible against the second trumpet sword line, along with the cadence's typical conclusions on Freya's module. The Meister doubles first and third trumpets at the octave. This pointedly ambivalent finish to the god's triumphant syntactic complex sweeps away his fears. He can lead his fellow gods into Valhalla brimming with confidence. We've almost made it. The next video, which concludes this analysis of Das Rheingold, picks up where this one leaves off, the second stave of page 305 in Dover's full score. As always, thanks for watching, and please do leave your comments. Time and energy allowing, I'll do everything I